Okay. So maybe we'll just get started as people are trickling in. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of Fairleigh Dickinson University. So this is our first environmental justice symposium. We've been really trying to bring more attention to environmental justice issues at the university. For example, last spring, Dr. Nicky Sheats, who's one of our guests today, came and spoke with us for Black History Month. He also came and spoke with our Honors Academy earlier this semester. So a lot of gratitude to Nicky Sheats. So we're extremely grateful and honored to have several of really the country's leaders and experts in environmental justice that are joining us today, generously offering their time on this very important set of issues. And then thank you to all of you for joining. So before we get started, I think we have a pretty diverse audience with us today who likely have different perspectives on environmental justice or might not even be so familiar with the concept. I think for a lot of us, even if we've heard of the term fairly often, there can be confusion around what the precise meaning of environmental justice is. I think this is in part because the environmental movement has focused so much on certain aspects of environmental protection while largely ignoring or de-emphasizing issues of social and economic justice. And so we'll hear different takes on this from all of our speakers today, but before we get started, I do just want to show you and read the definition of environmental justice.
Sorry, Elise, you're muted.
Okay. Have I been muted the whole time? Okay. So environmental justice is defined by the Environmental Protection Agency as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Okay, so it's a very complex, intersectional, and really important set of issues that's encompassed in environmental justice. And today we're really fortunate to have some of the best possible people to help us to kind of unravel some of that and understand some of that. So we want to maximize the amount of time that we have available. So we've divided this symposium into two parts with two speakers each, with time for questions after each panel. So we just would ask that you can write questions in the chat, but if you could wait until the end of our second speaker to ask your questions, that would be great. A few of our freshman Honors Academy students will be introducing each of our speakers in turn. So once they're finished, if you do have a question, we just ask that you raise your hand, and then we can call on you and unmute you so you can ask your question. If you don't feel comfortable, feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those as well. Okay, so with that, I am going to pass things over to Rahim Iftihar, who is going to introduce our first speaker today, which is Charles Lee.
Welcome, everyone. Our first speaker today is Charles Lee. He has been a leader of environmental justice since the 1970s, when the state of North Carolina made the decision to deal with its toxic waste problem by relocating tons of PCB-contaminated soil from the roadsides onto land occupied by predominantly Black people. He is currently the Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Environmental Justice with the Environmental Protection Agency. For 15 years before that, he ran the Environmental Justice Program for the United Church of Christ, a special program dedicated to environmental hazards faced by communities of color. Charles was working on the environmental justice issues before environmental justice was even a term. He wrote the transformative manuscript, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which has been cited as the first report using rigorous quantitative methods to show the disproportionate impacts of environmental pollution and hazards on minority and low-income communities. It is very difficult to summarize his many contributions to the environmental justice movement, but we are very fortunate and grateful to have him joining us today. In a 2009 article in the American Journal of Public Health dedicated to Charles Lee was a quote from his longtime colleague and friend, Richard Moore, the executive director of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. Charles is just a real humanitarian. He really cares about people, about improving their lives. He's also an intense human being who, when he is on it, he is not on it just a little bit. He is on it the whole way. He lives it, sleeps it, eats it, and breathes it. Let's give our attention to Charles, who will tell us a little bit about the history and present state of environmental justice in the United States.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my slides. Is that okay?
Yes.
That's the wrong one. There it goes. Is that it?
That looks good. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for that introduction. And one thing before I start, this presentation is a little bit longer than I had wanted or hoped it would be. So about 2 minutes before the end, just let me know, and then I'll go and start to conclude. And I wanted to first of all thank Fairleigh Dickinson University for inviting me here today. I'm really honored to be with some of the movers and shakers of environmental justice who are on this panel. And certainly it's always a pleasure to be talking with young people who are really looking to do something meaningful with their careers and make a difference. So with that, I would just start. And some of the introduction for me is, already there. So I won't, I'll dispense with a lot of that, other than to say that, recently this was some of the early history of environmental justice was written up in a really great article from in the Washington Post. And here is the article. And Raheem said that, I started working on environmental justice some 40 years ago before it even had a name. And as I was talk about in terms of, the arc of history that represents environmental justice, it's a pretty remarkable story now because from that point to today, when it is certainly now at the pinnacle of the nation's policy agenda. So a quick kind of sweep, and then I'll go into some details in terms of some of the early history of environmental justice, in terms of Warren County and two events which kind of catapulted environmental justice to the national stage, one of which was talked about in terms of that toxic waste and race report, and then the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and then the emergence of environmental justice in federal policy. There are many events associated with this, but certainly one of the most important is President Clinton's signing of Executive Order 12898 in 1994. So the very first one, Warren County in 1982, is seen as the event that kind of coalesced or brought together civil rights and the environmental movement in Warren County, North Carolina, where the siting of a PCB landfill, a PCB hazardous waste disposal landfill, sparked a protest that resulted in some 500 arrests. And I am not going to, for the sake of time, go into a lot of the kind of history that flow from that directly, but because of lack of time, and I want to cover, kind of a broad, good introduction for all of you. So suffice it to say that, that now with respect to a lot of these important iconic events in the emergence of environmental justice, that there is a rich history that's associated with each of them. But again, in 1982, we saw the convergence of two of the most important movements of the latter half of the 20th century, namely environmentalism and civil rights. And certainly, the person that said that, which is Dean Schmoke from Kurt Schmoke at Howard Law School, also said that environmental justice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And then I talked about toxic waste and race, and I do have to stop here and say that many people. This is the picture of the release of toxic waste and race at the National Press Club on April 15th in 1987. And I guess there's a lot of memorable things about this picture, but probably the most memorable for me is the fact that I still have black hair at that point. But the UCC Commission for Racial Justice did, we did issue that report, and it led to a cascading set of events, which resulted in a greater amount of academic research. The EPA's focusing on this ip in the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and many, many other things. It is also important to say that, at that time, there were very few, but not even a handful of studies that focus on disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards or harms. But now there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of peer-reviewed journal articles. Executive Order 12898 in 1994 was the first time this became the primary policy instrument for driving the integration of environmental justice in federal agencies, and had a big cascading effect in terms of many other levels of government. However, if you start to think about the kind of things that really went to implementing that executive order, it didn't really happen in a significant way until some 20 years later. And what I did here is to kind of show you some of the major products that came out of this thing called Plan EJ 2014 during the Obama administration, that laid a foundation or a suite of comprehensive policy guidance and tools for integrating environmental justice. Why is that the case? Why did it take so long? It's because it is really difficult, and we can discuss that more later. And then I wanted to make sure to kind of highlight another big arc of history with respect to environmental justice, which is the linkage between the emergence of a grassroots environmental justice movement in 1991 through that first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and to is what it is now today. Because for many years the EJ movement has been working at all different levels, and certainly the confluence of many different things has led to the fact now that it is embraced by the Biden administration as a major policy plank, if you will, and we can go into that some more at some point as well. So now switching a little bit, going into a more current kind of progress and challenges. I wanted to look at another arc of history in terms of environmental justice, and that has to do with some of the tools that will be used to identify and better characterize the areas of environmental justice concern. Some of these will be talked about by other speakers in a lot more detail than I will. I want to just kind of paint a certain picture here. I think a place I want to start is maybe about 10 years ago, or so about when EJ mapping tools began to look at the combinations of factors that address or contribute to disproportionate and cumulative impacts together, and in terms of both pollution burdens and population characteristics, and this is manifested within two tools: California's CalEnviro and US EPA's EJ screen. So that later, that broke ground in many different ways in terms of the development and use of EJ mapping tools, particularly looking at impacts cumulatively. Well, there's several things that flow from that, but one strand that flows from that is the usage of that to start to direct resources of scale to what in California the statute called the disadvantaged communities, or we know these are environmentally overburdened and economically and socially disadvantaged communities. And that's with a bill called Senate Bill 535, and then with Illinois' Future Energy's Jobs Act and New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which stipulated 40% of the renewable energy resources from that program will go into the disadvantaged communities. So, if you start to think about it, what's happening is that these are not only now, having its impact in those states and, reverberating and being looked by many other states, but it has become embraced by the Biden administration. And that is manifested in this executive order 14008, issued almost immediately after the President Biden was inaugurated. And that, call for, one of the big things to call for was this thing called a Justice 40 initiative, which would direct 40% of a set of climate-related resources to benefit disadvantaged communities, and the development now of a next iteration of EJ mapping tools focused around climate and economic justice. So this is a pretty significant sweep in terms of the history of environmental justice, but with respect to this particular historical arc, if you will. So going a little bit more detailed, I talked about Senate Bill 535 in California, which has the most experience or a track record on this. And if you think, and what that said was that 25% of the benefits of this thing called the greenhouse gas reduction fund will go to benefit disadvantaged communities. How are you going to determine that? Through Cal Enviro Screen. And that has actually led to now, billions of dollars. This is the figures in terms of the total amount of resources generated through 2019, which is something over $12 billion, at least 25% of which has gone into benefiting disadvantaged communities. So we're talking about now, a real serious look at the kind of investment resources that's necessary to address the kind of deep-seated issues within areas of EJ concern. And that is a pretty significant development in terms of, how are we going to finally address issues of environmental injustice. We also found that the existence of that kind of tool has also impacted the passage of many other kind of statutes, or it has influenced the implementation of that. And if you look down on the bottom right-hand side of the slide here, we're talking about bills in California, like the Human Right to Water, a bill that talks about getting or requiring all jurisdictions to address environmental justice in their general plans. So that's EJ and planning. It talks the bill that talks about SB 673, which talks about cumulative impacts and permitting, and 617, which is the creation of neighborhood-based, neighborhood scale community air protection programs. So we can go into a lot of detail on this, but I just wanted to kind of hit the highlights there. As we see now in this map, and this is actually a map that is somewhat out of date, actually, because this shows you some of the areas where major efforts are taking place to develop these second generation EJ mapping tools that look at impacts cumulatively in terms of both the environmental and social impacts, and this takes place both in many states and some municipal level. I think there are now 19 of these, as someone told me last, but here you see about I think 10 to 12 of these. There are guiding principles on your left upper right hand side that's been articulated for how one will go about developing these types of tools, including it being science-based, including it being informed by community experience, including it being owned and utilized by government, and so on and so forth. Not the least of which is the importance of this information being out there to help communities, to empower communities to advocate for themselves, because you've got a group of information that is validated by and embraced by government, that they can use in terms of advocating for ways to address the issues in their own communities. And also at the bottom right hand side of your slide, you can see the fact that there is now also a patterns emerging around how these are being developed, which is this kind of interdependent approach that includes the use of Cal EPA's Cal Enviro Screen methodology, plus the data elements from EJ Screen, which of course is available to everybody in the country, and additional available or desired state or local data elements. So that's that's one big area of progress, I think, I just wanted to share with everyone. So now I want to go into, and this is the subject of an article I recently wrote. Oh, by the way, the last article, the last discussion was the subject of an article that I wrote and published in last year, which I think was shared with all of you, so you can get more detail from that. And this is the subject of an article I wrote that was published in March of this year, that tries to start to look at the key, how to move forward EJ analysis so that it is meaningful and actionable, and is the heart of advancing to a next generation of EJ practice. And I just kind of will go through the high points in terms of for this. Of course, we now know, and there's a good understanding of the fact that EJ practice cannot be or should not be boxing to be checked exercise, which is essentially many of the much of the way that both federal agencies and state agencies go about this process. And this is called, this issue was taken with this very dramatically in this recent court case by the Fourth Circuit around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline's compressor station in Buckingham County, where the opinion famously said that environmental justice, because they had just looked at the results of an EJ screen or some mapping tool, and basically totally missed the mark in terms of what the population in that community was. And so what the Fourth Circuit opinion opined on was the fact that in fact, environmental justice cannot be something you just check the box and be done with. And I think this represents a lot of the kind of challenges within how do you integrate environmental justice into governmental decision making. And so this slide is actually from US EPA's website that talks about the differences, or not differences, but the ways that you would think about fair treatment, which has to do with how do you address disproportionate impacts in a meaningful and actionable way, versus how you look at meaningful involvement. And the point here is to show you what the imbalances in terms of both the ability to articulate what you're trying to accomplish, and in fact, what you're trying to accomplish. Much of this is gotten from a New Jersey-based scholar, Anna Batista, who was with the from the Ironbound community in Newark. She is now she now teaches at the New School, but her PhD thesis focused exactly on this, and she basically said at that point that EJ practice in government agencies have really stagnated at a point of just looking at community participation and nothing more. And she brought up the need for for government agencies to look at EJ from the point of view of structural justice, from the point of view of the kind of structural systemic inequities that underlie a lot of decisions that contribute to environmental disparities. And one can see that we are still a long way from that. So what does this mean in terms of then, how do we start to think about this? And, I think it would be good to step back and just kind of think about what are disproportionate environmental health impacts, and what are the drivers, and the drivers being within things like the built environment, the natural environment and the social environment. And so the built environment being things related to, in this case, pollution sources, The natural environment being things that have to do with perhaps climate, heat waves, pandemics, and the social environment being this term called social determinants of health. And if you can see, you look at this slide, these three, this Venn diagram, you can see the interrelationships between the three. Now, I also want to point out that the interrelationships between the three is just not something that we put together and say there's a logical kind of connection here, but there's lots of evidence of the connection of the. For example, a recent Harvard School of Public Health study around the correlation between PM 2.5 exposure and COVID mortality. And certainly we know that there is the impacts of PM 2.5 is disproportionately felt in Black and Brown communities. So taking this now, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, I think, but it might be good just to kind of hear. When we started talking about disproportionate impacts or cumulative impacts, this was all done through anecdotal accounts of what communities actually look like. Here are some picture examples of these. But as important and powerful as they are, it also would be good and to begin to be able to put them in a way that you can start to become a lot more empirical and a lot more quantitative and a lot more analytically rigorous. And so what that meant was that we started to be able to identify discrete factors which contribute to a lot of these disproportionate cumulative burdens. And this is an example of such from the factors which are, or the indicators which are reflected in Cal Enviro Screen 3.0. And again, these are pollution burdens and population characteristics, or population characteristics which make a community more vulnerable to pollution effects. Now, if you think about this, if you can start to have discrete factors and quantify them, then with modern GIS or geographic information system technology, you can actually then begin to map them or visualize them. And this is what it results in EJ Screen, Cal Enviro Screen, and then many other kind of mapping tools that are beginning to emerge, that have or will be emerging. And certainly this helps us to begin to not just define, but articulate and better characterize these communities. In fact, being able to do that is not something that there's not a lot of work done already. And here are just two examples of not only data sources, which are useful in identifying and characterizing disproportionate cumulative impacts, but also there are now very sophisticated, well thought out quantitative studies and EJ analysis in this context. One of those tools, and I don't know how much I'll go into detail around this, but is a tool that emerged in California to identify these areas called disadvantaged unincorporated areas, which are communities like colonias or migrant communities near in the Central Valley or San Joaquin Valley of California, which are without water systems or other basic amenities. And this was used to help inform the passage of a bill called the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act in California, which provided significant resources, meaning approximately $1 billion or $1.3 billion over 10 years to implement California's human right to water. This one here is a example of EJ analysis that begins to approximate what I think is necessary to really get to a good analysis of these of disproportionate impacts. And this is the civil rights complaint with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And this talks about the waste siting situation in Detroit. And going through this very quickly, you can see the differential in terms of the percentage of people of color living in host communities versus non-host communities. The fact that 94% of the waste in Wayne County, which is Detroit, where these issues are being, where the area of these issues is coming from out of the county, and even out of the state, and even out of the country. And of course, this is an area that is confronts multiple environmental issues, as seen by these results from the EJ screen. And then lastly, it talks about the history or the roots of these issues in terms of the history of redlining and segregation within that community, and certainly this is if you want to understand not only how the fact that these kind of disparities are taking place, but why they're taking place, and how one may begin to better address them. Just looking at these roots of the EJ issues is a really important factor, or in my opinion. Then it started looking at this from another way. There's a kind of upsurge of.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I really don't want to cut you off, because this is also interesting and important.
So you want me to start to wrap up?
Just maybe in a few minutes, just so we have time for the other people.
No,
but maybe when we
so let me just go through this quickly. This is looking at redlining maps of the redlining areas in the 1930s overlaid against current environmental conditions in terms of CalEnviro screen. This is one using EJ screen, and I added this because Dr. Laumbach is going to talk about use of EJ screen. This is just another way of using it. There's studies that associate this with current environmental conditions, like urban location, urban heat islands. There's studies now that look at how residential segregation is correlated with the health outcomes, like estimated cancer risk from ambient air toxics. I won't go through this slide, which talks about why is it that mostly the other side of the tracks is usually on the east side of town, because they tend to be downwind because of the wind patterns are normally given the rotation of the earth from west to east. And then let me just start to conclude by saying that talking about, and this brings it home to New Jersey, this whole discussion that I was just going through informs, or are the elements of the linkage of environmental justice issues to the conversation around systemic racism. And it is in fact the convergence of environmental justice, this kind of national conversation about systemic racism, Black Lives Matter, that really drove the passage of the landmark bill, a law, environmental justice law in New Jersey around cumulative impacts and permitting. You're going to hear a lot about this from Nicky and Maria, but certainly, this quote here is a really kind of eloquent way of talking about understanding the dynamics between these issues. And certainly the other way to look at this would be how this has resulted, the same dynamic has resulted in the Biden administration's embrace of racial equity, climate and environmental justice in a whole government approach. That is really we have never seen before, at least certainly not in my 40 years of working on this issue. So let me just stop there, Elise. I hope I wrapped that up in good time.
Yes, that was great.
And I would pause share, or
yeah, if you
is that good? Did I do that right?
yeah, it looks good. You're still sharing. I think if you click the stop share
Stop share.
button,
There it goes.
there
Okay.
you go.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
There it goes.
no, that's good. Thank you so much for that. And so I'm sure you all have questions, but if you could just hold them until after our second speaker, Dr. Rob Laumbach, who's going to speak with us next. We do have an introduction from him, so I'm going to pass it over to you.
Hi, our next speaker today is Dr. Robert Laumbach. He's an associate professor, physician, and medical researcher in the Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences Institute at Rutgers University School of Public Health. Dr. Laumbach has been dedicated to investigating and communicating about the cumulative and interactive impacts of pollution and other environmental stressors on human health, specifically the race and income disparities of those effects. Throughout his career, Dr. Laumbach has been a committed advocate for environmental justice. He served on the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Science Advisory Board and the New Jersey Clean Air Council, directed community outreach and engagement for the NIEHS Center for Environmental Exposure and Disease, and has ongoing collaborations with the Ironbound Community Corporation and the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, two organizations with which our final two guests, Maria Lopez-Nunez and Dr. Nicky Sheats, are affiliated. His research is incredibly important, informing on policies that help to mitigate environmental injustice in our states. Let's give our attention now to Dr. Laumbach, who will talk about his research and the cumulative impacts of environmental pollution.
Myself. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm going to speak a little bit more locally here in New Jersey about cumulative impacts and environmental justice. But first of all, just a few observations about cumulative impacts. So we can certainly see that there are multiple adverse health outcomes or the burden of disease that varies quite a bit between different populations. So we see, disparities in risk, differences in risk for asthma, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart disease, diabetes, birth outcomes, cancer. A lot of chronic disease that varies in populations and primarily is worse in people of color and low-income communities. And then we also have multiple environmental and social stressors, many of which Charles just touched upon, that include both chemical, so what we usually refer to as pollution in the environment, as well as non-chemical or social determinants of health. And these affect our health both cumulatively over time and also put together. So whether it's exposures that occurred early in life that then affect us later in life, or exposures that are happening today that are combined with other exposures, both chemical and non-chemical, that lead to disease, and also what's going to happen to us tomorrow. All that accumulates. And this really varies disproportionately with communities by race, ethnicity, and income primarily. So at the institute where I work, one of the centers, the Center for Environmental Exposure and Disease, has a community engagement core that I direct. And we've chosen to focus along this transportation industrial corridor here in New Jersey, where there is a legacy of pollution, all different sorts of pollution from the chemical industry and so on. And then also, even today, currently, there is a lot of air pollution, especially traffic-related air pollution along this corridor of the Turnpike and Route 1 and 9. And what we find is that, this area of New Jersey, this sort of necklace around the neck of New Jersey, includes the highest densities of population in New Jersey. So more New Jerseyans live along this sort of path here. And then also, when we do a little bit more analysis across the state, and this is done by my colleague Panos Georgopoulos, who has looked at this endemic, as Charles mentioned, of COVID-19 and what the demographic and environmental correlates are for that. We also see that COVID-19 has tended also to occur more along this corridor, and then also low income folks who are lower income and communities tend to be along this corridor, and then also more minorities along this corridor quite clearly, and then a variety of environmental pollutants, and here diesel exhaust particles also tend to be higher along this corridor, the darker color here. And we can look even further at other demographic and air pollution and risk factors, such as the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. Again, higher levels of social vulnerability. That includes race, income, but also housing, access to transportation. Then we have looking at a variety of health risks. This is a cancer risk from the EPA's National Air Toxics inventory that is risk that is modeled. Then we also have contaminated sites across New Jersey, again, quite clearly along this corridor. And then also vulnerable populations, like here, long-term care facilities. So the number of long-term care facilities along also that corridor. So I want to switch a little bit and just show a little bit of detail on a more local scale from the EJ screen, from the EPA's EJ screen. So I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to go into this online EJ screen, which is publicly available. It's easily used. The EPA has a really nice website that includes access to the EJ screen tool, as well as tutorials and other information. But what I have here is some of the communities that I've been working in, which include Newark, Elizabeth, and Jersey City, which are sort of clustered around a major transportation hub here, which includes the seaport of Newark and Elizabeth and Liberty International Airport, which are sources of air pollution. And that's the area that I've worked in more is air pollution, especially traffic-related air pollution. And then we also have here like the city of Plainfield in Union County. So, Elizabeth is in Union County, Newark is in Essex County. In both of these counties, Elizabeth and Newark are on the eastern ends of the counties, and there are many more affluent areas, Livingston, Maplewood, and so forth, Westfield and Union County. And so this, what we're seeing right now is the demographic indicators, and they're actually in percent. Sorry.
Rob?
Yeah.
So I think we need to switch what you're sharing to the other, because you're sharing your PowerPoint, you would just need to stop share and then.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sorry, I meant to share the screen. Maybe I.
No problem. Make that mistake all the time.
All right. Okay, now you can see it.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay, that's good. As I was saying, then here's Newark, here's Elizabeth, here's Jersey City, and then I've outlined here Newark Airport and the seaport of Elizabeth and Newark. And then here, like I said, is Plainfield. That's a predominantly African-American community. But what we see is the sharp gradation, the sharp fall off of the percentiles. This is the national percentile for, in this case, people of color. That we see, clustered in Newark and Elizabeth and Plainfield, and then also Jersey City. And then we can look at low income, add that to the map, same pattern. We can look at linguistically isolated, add that to the map. We see pretty much the same pattern. Then we can switch over to the EJ indices. And these include not only the demographic measure, but also pollution. So if we go to the NADA diesel particulate matter, add that to the map, we see the same pattern. We look at, let's say, neonatal cancer risk. We see the same pattern. We look at, let's say, hazardous waste proximity. We see the same pattern. So, this is a tool that can help us to visualize what are really apparent, patterns of disproportionate impact of not only the risk factors, environmental health risk factors, these indicators like indicators of pollution, but also vulnerability like income, vulnerability like factors that go along with race, for example. So I'm going to switch back. Okay, so these are many different factors along many different dimensions, right? So usually, when we do sort of risk assessment, we're looking to quantify risk. We want to put that all on a dimension of what's the numerical risk. But, in many ways, we can only really imagine how these factors interact. And it's really hard to understand and very difficult to tease apart what are the most important factors or how these factors work together. And really, reductionist science, which tries to isolate single factors by controlling everything else other than a single factor, really doesn't work in this situation. And as Charles said, we really need to look at the underlying drivers, whether it's race and racism, whether it's income, whether it's historical, structural issues like the redlining that he mentioned, whether it's the built environment, which is essentially policy and concrete. These things are going to be difficult to change, but they need to be changed, and policies need to be reformed, and EJ has to have a prominent role in these policies in order for there really be progress. But these cumulative impacts have real consequences for public health. So one way of sort of looking at the overall cumulative impact of factors affecting health is life expectancy. If we look at life expectancy in New Jersey, it's over 85 years here in this area in the suburbs in Western Union County and Essex County, whereas it's 73 years in most of the zip codes, or about 73 years in Newark, Elizabeth, and Jersey City. So really, again, the cumulative impact of all these factors on life expectancy. And then if we look at asthma disparities, this is some data that contrasts the hospital admissions for asthma in terms of the rate, comparing Newark and the rest of Essex County. So you can see that the crude rate of asthma hospital admission for children in Newark is about 3.77, for the rest of Essex County, 1.63. So Newark is over twice the rate of asthma hospitalization. You might ask, well, why is that? Well, certainly there may be factors like access to healthcare. There may be factors like knowledge, access to medication, but there are also triggers and factors that we know influence asthma. And it's most likely, again, a combination of these factors together, and we have to really address all of them. And it's not going to be very productive to try to tease out what individual factors might be most important. They all have to be addressed. So in Newark, the question has been asked, why is childhood asthma worse in Newark? And one of those factors is, like I showed on the map, that Newark and Elizabeth and some of our other more vulnerable populations surround the Liberty Airport and the Port of Newark and Elizabeth. And there's a whole transportation nexus, a web of highways, heavily trafficked roadways around that area. And we know that diesel exhaust is associated with worsening of asthma, in studies across the country and around the world. So the question might be asked though too, what is the cumulative impact with psychosocial stress in neighborhoods that are lower income, in neighborhoods that might have higher crime rates, in neighborhoods that have more noise and other stressors? So we partnered with the Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark to ask these questions in a study. So we asked, does stress make children with asthma more susceptible to diesel exhaust? Is there some physiological reason why kids who are more stressed psychologically would then respond more to diesel exhaust? in terms of making their asthma worse. And then we also applied for a grant and received an EPA STAR grant, which were awarded for evaluating the interaction of non-chemical and chemical stressors. So, you know, one of the issues that we confronted as we looked at this issue was that there's somewhat of a paradox in that higher psychosocial stress has been associated with worse asthma overall. But if you look at it physiologically, acute stress from asthma releases the stress hormone epinephrine and also cortisol. Well, epinephrine actually opens the airways and was actually used some time ago as asthma therapy. You give someone a shot of epinephrine, it opens their airways. Also, cortisol is one of the mainstays in terms of inhaled corticosteroids for asthma because it's anti-inflammatory. So working with community groups, we developed a new hypothesis that perhaps exposure to chronic stress blunts the protective acute stress of that can actually respond to asthma. So when a child has an asthma exacerbation or an adult, you know, one of the worst kind of stressors, one of the most intense stressors is not being able to breathe. So the idea is that the body responds to that in an adaptive way by releasing epinephrine and cortisol to open the airways. And that chronic stress, though, might be blunting that because there's chronic stressors all the time. The body starts to adapt to that and doesn't release as much acute stress hormones when it's needed. So in our study, we did a community-based study working, again, primarily with the Ironbound Community Corporation, where we recruited 34 kids with asthma between the ages of 8 and 14. They wore these small monitors to measure their exposure to diesel exhaust as black carbon. They wore them for up to 30 days, 24 hours a day. We also did some other monitoring for other air pollution. And we also assessed their chronic stress by doing an interview with them and their parents, and then also measuring cortisol levels in the body. And then we measured nitric oxide, which is a marker of inflammation every day with the children and their lung function also. And then look for correlations between changing levels of the air pollution, changing levels of the diesel exhaust, which do change from day to day, depending on, you know, wind speed and direction, whether the air over the city is stagnant that day, for example. And we look for these correlations. And I can tell you that right now we haven't released the results to people in the community. So we're waiting to do that before we make any other public announcements. But in general, we did find that there was an association between black carbon, the diesel exhaust marker, and worsening of asthma. And the stress part of it, we're still really working on that. But this shows you really like how difficult it is to sort of tease out these effects. It's something that we need to do. But really what we need is a holistic approach to cumulative impacts that focuses on those root causes. So on poverty, racism, other causes of health disparities, the built environment, as mentioned before, as well as the air pollution, obviously. And then we also want to consider that there should be mandatory consideration of EJ and cumulative impacts in the pollution permitting process. And that's something that's been advanced. And our next speakers will talk about that with the EJ and cumulative impacts bill in New Jersey and the rulemaking. And then we also need, I think, targeted enforcement in communities of its existing regulations. And then also we need to help new technology like clean trucks and buses, and especially promoting those in EJ areas. And then finally, I think, you know, other efforts to improve health overall will increase resilience to pollution. So that includes, again, fighting poverty with higher wages, access to healthcare, healthy food, education, that we know are associated with improved health. And then also, again, addressing the built environment, complete streets, green space, recreation facilities, you know, these things that can make people more resilient and reduce susceptibility to the adverse effects of air pollutants and other environmental pollution. I just wanted to make some acknowledgements for Panos Georgopoulos, who did our maps, and his graduate students, and then a whole host of others who have been collaborators, as well as the US EPA and the NIEHS, a division of the NIH. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was interesting and disappointing, those correlations. Not surprising, but it's nice to have data to actually support those inclusions. Yeah. So let's open it up to some questions. Maybe we'll take a few before we move on to the second part of the symposium, and then we'll have some time at the end where we can ask questions for all of our speakers today. So if you have a question, I just would ask you to raise your hand, and then I can, using the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you push that button and you can raise your hand that way, then I can unmute you, or we can all unmute you, and you can ask your question. I see, yes, Joseph Morton. I think you should be able to unmute now.
Okay. The question I have is, to me, what seems like a real problem is that, you talk about community involvement, and when it comes to trying to resolve issues, the community rarely has the resources against whomever is involved in creating the hazard to begin with. And how do you establish equity or some sort of equality in terms of the community being able to respond in a way that is effective? In most cases, they can try, but they're generally unsuccessful because the polluter or whoever's involved, they have way more resources available to them, and the community just cannot respond adequately to that. And so how do you establish some sort of equality? Do you hire lawyers, or what do you do to try and achieve some sort of equality in the interaction?
I might take a stab at that. One example, I think, of a progressive way of doing that is the EJ bill that was just passed in New Jersey, which requires a permit applicant or someone revising a major permit, party revising a major permit, to do an EJ impact statement that then has to be presented at least one public meeting, and they're responsible for doing the analysis. But there is still that issue, I think, of like the asymmetry. I think that might be addressed a little bit more by our next speaker, but the Department of Environmental Protection will have requirements for that statement and what it has to include. So that also should help to make sure that they do a comprehensive job, and then they communicate it clearly. And then there has to be public input about the decision about permitting. So it's an attempt to address that issue, which is recognized.
Yeah, so building off of what Rob said, I mean, I think the only way to answer that quickly is that there's probably a multiple set of strategies that needs to be employed, including, like, for example, I mentioned about data being out there as can be a third-party validator. So that's information, that communities can point to, to make their case. There's also just a whole suite of activities that should go into building capacity on the part of communities to better organize and advocate and advance programs. And then, of course, the last thing is better taking all this information, like Rob was suggesting, in multiple forms, and making sure that government, there are specific processes in mind, like the public health impact or EJ impact statement, or that assessment that has to be made, or other variations of that go into that are essentially, better forms of environmental justice analysis that must be part of permit processes, that must be part of rulemaking processes, that and that can be integrated into other types of activities. So that's a big question you just asked, and that we can just begin to offer some inklings of things that must be done or should be done.
Gabriella.
Yeah, so we tend to see technology and innovation as like a constant positive, but is there a way in which technology could possibly harm in terms of environmental justice for the future?
Not totally sure what you mean by that. That question. So maybe you can kind of restate it and to tease it out a little bit more.
Well, like we say technology and like we could think of like new innovations for like clean energy and stuff like that. But are there like possible future enhancements in technology that you could think of that could possibly harm these neighborhoods that are at risk?
Yeah. No, I hear you. No, thank you for that. I think that everybody needs to understand that whatever technology comes forward has unintended consequences. I mean, that's almost a given, right? And it's better to think about that. Like, for example, all the move towards electric cars is just going to create this need to how are we going to dispose of all the batteries? I mean, that's just a big public policy question that needs to be addressed sooner than later. So that's just one example, right? But I think you can probably find examples of that in almost virtually everything. I mean, all this great new use of electronic equipment, that has liberated so many different ways of thinking analysis comes with all these disposal issues in terms of electronic equipment and the dangers that's associated with that.
Just to add to that a little too, I think that although, for example, electric vehicles are net benefit, they could be disproportionate in terms of their availability to people of higher income, for example, and lead to exacerbation of again, inequities, even though perhaps the overall benefit is positive, but so that's another consideration. Considering equity by itself, as well as, overall benefit in terms of reducing exposure, let's say, to pollutants.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we'll take a couple more questions. So, Harold, you were first.
My question is: I know there are now some laws in place, but maybe that's more directed to Charles Lee. But what do you think is the role of civil disobedience? Do you think it still plays an important role and it's necessary to move things forward? Or do you think now it's moving on, more regulatory ways of changing up things?
Well, I think that all the processes that went into better engagement up to and end, including when communities really need to be emphatic about their statements are very important. So I don't think that anything that's being done, hopefully that should not be needed, but it is really up to the communities to decide what is needed, right? To make their point. And certainly, there's I don't think this means that that any of that is presumed that we should presume that should stop by any means. So I think that should be probably the best way to kind of summarize that the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe so one last question, Salvatore. Let me unmute you.
Hi, thank you. So during the presentations, the first thing I couldn't help but think of was the Flint, Michigan water crisis. I was wondering what steps were taken, if any, to address that, and also how could it have gone on for so long while being ignored?
Charles, did you have experience related to Flint? I haven't.
Well, not directly,
okay.
but I certainly I wasn't totally sure exactly the question, but let me try to restate it. I mean, certainly the history of it could have been avoided. I mean, that is clear now, right? I mean, that, evidence was brought to the fore in terms of the existence of, the problem, way before any regulator, meaning either Michigan DEP or US EPA acted. It did take, pretty extraordinary measures on the part of people, both the communities and, researchers, to bring forward evidence that kind of forced the issue. So, and that should not have been necessary.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to the next couple of speakers. So our next speaker is going to be Nicky Sheats, who's tired of hearing from us, calling on him to share his knowledge with us. But could the next student go ahead and introduce Dr. Sheats for us?
Yeah, so our next speaker for the second part of our symposium is Dr. Nicky Sheats. Dr. Sheats is a tireless and dedicated lifelong leader in environmental justice. He is the director of the Urban Policy Institute at Kean University, co-founder and president of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, and was recently appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, along with Maria Lopez-Nunez, who we will hear from next. He has a long string of degrees, including a master's degree in public policy from Princeton University, as well as both a law degree and a PhD in earth and planetary sciences from Harvard University. He is a member of the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change, the Environmental Justice and Science Initiative, the Building Equity and Alignment Initiative, and an informal environmental justice attorney group. Additionally, he has experience on serving on several state and federal advisory councils, including the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and Clean Air Advisory Committee, and the New Jersey Clean Air Council. He was absolutely instrumental in the development, advocacy, and passing of the New Jersey Cumulative Impacts Bill, the first of its kind in the entire country. He's a humble, generous, inspiring, and incredible human being who has done so much for the environmental justice movement. Please join me now in listening to Dr. Nicky Sheats, who will talk to us about his environmental justice work and the differences between policies.
I just have to there you go. Now you should be able to. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, let me say right off, you can tell what generation I'm in. My name is not Nubian8 at Verizon.net. That's my email address. Usually I can change it when I come on, but for some reason Zoom's not allowing me to change it. I'll take care of it for the next one. But I guess, let me see if I can share the screen at least. There we go. Are people seeing my PowerPoint now?
Yep.
Okay. Oh. How's that?
That looks great.
Okay. All right. So I am not tired of being here. I think I am worried about the opposite, that I'm gonna turn my timer on here. I think I'm worried about the opposite, that folks at FDU will be tired of hearing from me. So thank you for inviting me to be part of it. Thank you for organizing it, Elise, and your colleagues, both faculty and students. I definitely enjoyed talking to you all. And Charles did a good job of the history of the EJ movement. And I just wanted to extend that to one other area. I wanted to say that and make you aware of that there is a difference between the EJ movement and the environmental movement. And at times we are driven to different policy positions, and I'm going to talk about one of them today. And I think that arises primarily because we are really concerned at our core about different issues. The environmental justice movement is primarily concerned about protecting communities. And we care about the physical environment, but our main concern is about protecting communities. And the environmental movement, their main concern is about protecting the physical environment. Now, they're also concerned about protecting communities, but that's not their primary concern. And because we have different primary concerns, I would argue that we're pushed to different policy positions at times. And I'm going to talk about one of those times now where we have been pushed to different policy positions, and it's in a crucial area, and that's climate change mitigation policy. But before we get to that, let me start by showing a figure that I show all the time. I want to apologize to my New Jersey colleague, Maria Lopez-Nunez, because she's seen this so many times. She could talk about it herself now in detail. But I'm glad I have a new audience to show it to. I like the figure so much. And these figures were developed by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So not by us, as I like to say, crazy EJ folks. And they show the relationship in New Jersey between race, income, and pollution. And you've heard about that already. So this is kind of a different format to show it to you. So what they did was they started out, you've heard a lot about cumulative impacts, and Maria's going to go more into that in the next presentation. I'm going to talk about climate change mitigation policy, but cumulative impacts is so important that we start out by talking about cumulative impacts to motivate what I'm going to talk about. So the first thing New Jersey DEP did was they developed a relative cumulative impact score for every neighborhood in New Jersey. And in this case, you can think about the definition of cumulative impacts being a very rough estimate of the total amount of pollution in a neighborhood. So they come up with a cumulative impact score, and then they say, well, what's the relationship between cumulative impacts, or the total amount of pollution in New Jersey neighborhoods, and race and income? So they graphed it. Look at the top figure. It shows as the number of people of color living in New Jersey neighborhoods increases, what happens to the estimated level of pollution? It increases. And it's the same thing for people living in poverty. As the number of low-income residents in New Jersey neighborhood increases, so does the estimated level of pollution. So what this is providing evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to what? Race and income, the amount of money in your pocket, the color of your skin, and that goes against everything that our state and our nation at least profess to stand for when it comes to justice and fairness. And, you know, it really should make you mad. I have shown this so many times, I said, but every time I see it, the anger starts to rise up again. And it explains why those of us in this panel are concerned about environmental justice and a part of the environmental justice community. And I hasten to add that this is not unique to New Jersey, as Charles has already said. And if other states did similar studies, many of them would have similar findings, I believe. And in fact, one of the things that started the environmental justice movements in the late 1980s were similar national reports. They had similar findings, such as the report that Charles wrote in the late 1980s that he told you about. So in New Jersey and around the country, EJ communities, and we know about this relationship. In New Jersey, we knew this relationship existed, and it was confirmed by these graphs. But the EJ community in New Jersey felt like, well, we got to do something to address the disproportionate amount of pollution that you see here depicted in EJ neighborhoods. One reason I like to show the figures is because even though the environmental justice neighborhoods are not named, look to the right of your screen and you can see them. And you can see, to the right of your screen, you can see that there's disproportionate amount of pollution loads estimated to be in those neighborhoods. Newark, by the way, which is about 88% of color, just to give you a landing point, right, would be way to the right of the screen. So we felt in New Jersey, we had to develop policies to address this disproportionate pollution burden. And I'm going to talk to you about one of them, and Maria's going to talk to you about another. So let me argue to you that there are two broad categories of policies, I think, that need to be addressed to address cumulative impacts. One will be policies and laws that address the disproportionate pollution burden you see directly through the concept of cumulative impacts. And you'll hear about that law coming up. Another broad category of policies will be policies that address the different types of pollution that go into composing the disproportionate pollution burden that you see. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about next. And let me just add that the reason we are concerned about the disproportionate pollution burden, and I think Rob has gone over this, right, is because we think it's connected to the disproportionate disease and death rate that we find in the United States that is rooted at least partly in race and income. So the type of policy I'm going to talk about that we feel needs to be tailored and customized so that it addresses the disproportionate pollutant burden in EJ communities is climate change mitigation policy. As you probably know, climate change mitigation policy is policy we developed to actually fight and stop climate change, and it's directed at reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, usually carbon dioxide. And from an EJ perspective, basically what we're saying is that this type of policy should not only fight climate change, and we're down with that, by the way, but it should also be used to, again, address the disproportionate pollution burden in EJ communities. It should also be used to specifically help EJ communities. And how this should happen is really stated in that top bullet point that you see in front of you. So what, from an EJ perspective, what we want from climate change mitigation policy, right, in addition to fighting climate change, are guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized, but reductions either way. So let's pull apart that paragraph and see what it means. And this is the essence of the talk. I could stop talking after this. I won't, I like to talk, but if you understand that, you got it, you get the presentation. So let's go clause by clause. Guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities. Well, we know what an EJ community is, or you've heard me refer to it, communities of color, low-income communities. Why do we say guaranteed emissions reductions? Because isn't climate change mitigation all about delivering emissions reductions? Yes, but as I'll talk about in a minute, not all climate change mitigation policy dictates that we get reductions everywhere. And that's an issue we'll talk about. So let's go to the second clause, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized. Well, we know what a greenhouse gas is, gases that cause climate change, and typically we're talking about carbon dioxide. But what's a greenhouse gas co-pollutant? Think of a power plant. A power plant emits a lot of carbon dioxide, but it also emits other air pollutants along with the carbon dioxide. And in the lexicon of climate change mitigation policy, these other pollutants are called greenhouse gas co-pollutants. And an important difference to point out between the greenhouse gas and the co-pollutants are that the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are not thought to hurt you directly. Instead, they hurt you by causing climate change, and climate change hurts you. But the co-pollutants do hurt you and people living near them in communities living near power plants, harms them directly. And also are part of go into composing the disproportionate pollution burden that you've heard so much about from Charles and Rob and myself, and you will hear about from Maria. So what we really want from climate change mitigation policies, not only to fight climate change, but to reduce emissions of these co-pollutants, and in that way improve the health of local communities, particularly EJ communities, which are overburdened with pollution. So ideally, we would want a climate change mitigation policy that not only reduces carbon dioxide and hits whatever carbon dioxide reduction goal you have, but also maximizes reductions of co-pollutants while it is hitting this carbon dioxide reduction goal. No climate change policy that we know of does that yet. So the next best thing we ask for is, let's get mandatory reductions of greenhouse gases in EJ communities, because when we get those reductions in greenhouse gases, we're also going to get some incidental reduction of greenhouse gas co-pollutants. So we want power plants located in EJ communities to be forced to reduce their emissions, no matter what climate change mitigation policy they fall under. And what the science is telling us, this is more on co-pollutants. The co-pollutant that we are most worried about is fine particulate matter. All right, I think Rob talked about this. Airborne particles that are small enough, fine refers to the size, 2.5 microns in diameter, all airborne particles less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And in this case, size matters because they're small enough to get into your lungs, and they cause a lot of premature death and a lot of disease. And they are an EJ issue because concentrations of fine particulate matter air pollution tend to be higher in EJ communities. So that's the co-pollutant that we are talking about the most. And one thing I'll say is that what the science is telling us is that there is no lower threshold for fine particulate matter, below which, if you keep reducing it, you won't get health benefits. I'll say that in English. The lower the concentration of fine particulate matter in the air, the better off we are. And climate change mitigation policy presents us with the opportunity not only to fight climate change, but to reduce the concentration of these co-pollutants, such as fine particulate matter, to concentrations we haven't been able to reduce them to so far. And let me make this clear. There are policies in place to reduce concentration of fine particulate matter and other co-pollutants like nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides. But what we're saying is that we should use climate change mitigation policy in conjunction with these policies that are already being used, so we can drive down concentrations of these co-pollutants as low as possible. And really for two reasons. Because even though we have national standards, right? Like we have a national standard for fine particulate matter, even though we have those standards, even when that standard is being met, fine particulate matter is still killing people and making them ill. So the standards are not protective enough. And when we talk about the super pollution, all the pollution put together, especially cumulative pollution, especially in EJ communities, we have a problem with air pollution, particularly in EJ communities. And climate change mitigation policy will give us an opportunity to help it. If we use climate change mitigation policy in this way, right, to help reduce the pollution load in EJ communities, we would make sure that climate change mitigation policy starts to save lives as soon as it's employed. So we wouldn't have to wait for the next heat wave. We wouldn't have to wait for the next severe storm for climate change mitigation policy to help us. It would help us right away. And look, I'm not making light of any of those detrimental climate change impacts, because we in New Jersey know how harmful they can be due to Sandy. But if we use climate change policy in the way the EJ community is advocating, it would start saving lives in communities right away, as soon as it's employed, especially in EJ communities. And it would make climate change policy immediately relevant to these communities. Because remember now, a lot of times, communities of color and low-income communities are left out of the discussion about climate change. And this would make those policies immediately relevant to those communities and hopefully gain more political support for climate change mitigation policy. This slide was just designed to say, we need to address a disproportionate amount of air pollution in EJ communities because EJ communities are disproportionately exposed. I said that twice, that's redundant, isn't it? We need to use climate change mitigation policy to address air pollution in EJ communities because EJ communities are disproportionately exposed to air pollution. So what's the problem? I put forth what the EJ community thinks is a pretty conceptually easy thing to get your arms around. That we want to make sure the climate change mitigation policy delivers emissions reductions in EJ communities. Well, the problem from an EJ perspective is that one of the main climate change mitigation policies, if not the main climate change mitigation policy used in our country today, is called carbon trading. And carbon trading does not mandate reductions at any specific location. It's a market-based policy. And as such, it does not say that power plant in Newark, that from an EJ perspective, we want to force to reduce emissions because it's putting out more pollution in an overburdened EJ community. Carbon trading will not necessarily mandate reductions at that facility. Instead, it would say that in New Jersey, we have to receive an overall carbon dioxide reduction goal. And if the plants meet that collectively, if that goal is met collectively, even if that plant in Newark does not reduce, that's all right under carbon trading. That's not all right under environmental justice. And in this way, we have defined where emissions reductions occur as an EJ issue, an equity issue. In this way, climate change mitigation policy leaves EJ, justice, and equity to chance because it leaves where those reductions occur, it leaves that decision to the market. And we think, right, EJ community thinks that decision should be intentional and planned. And ironically, and that's a nice term for it, we have what may be the most important environmental policy that we'll develop, certainly one of the most important ones, climate change mitigation policy. It means that we have a climate change mitigation policy that one of the most important policy we'll ever develop. It means that that policy will not guarantee pollution reductions in the communities with the most pollution. Now, let me be careful with what I'm saying. I'm not saying that carbon trading will never deliver emissions reductions in EJ communities. What I'm saying is that under carbon trading, three things can happen. Three things can happen to emissions in EJ communities. Emissions can be reduced, they can stay the same, or the worst case scenario is they can increase. And from an EJ perspective, carbon trading will leave you with certain questions unanswered. And that they are, how many EJ communities will receive emissions reductions? Which EJ communities will receive emissions reductions? What will be the magnitude of those reductions? How big will they be? And over what time period will they occur? Will they happen now and you won't get reductions later? Will they happen later and you won't get reductions now? All these questions would be left to be answered if you have a carbon trading system. And from an environmental justice perspective, that's not good enough. So look, we think we have a partial solution to the disproportionate amount of pollution in EJ communities, right? By saying under climate change mitigation policy, a plant located in EJ community has to reduce its emissions no matter what kind of climate change mitigation policy that is being used. But we understand that when you implement this, it's not as easy as it sounds. We'll have to answer other questions. What's an EJ community? We start to answer that in New Jersey, as Maria will talk about. And I just posed another question: how much will, what kind of reductions are we talking about? What will be the size of those reductions? But we think we can work those out if the state or the federal government will commit to this type of policy. I want to just reiterate a few arguments that the climate change mitigation policy should yield reductions above those being used now by other policies. And I want to say that even if this type of proposal is implemented, we know this will not be a silver bullet, right? This will not take care of all the disproportionate amount of pollution in EJ communities. We're going to need a suite of policies to address disproportionate pollution. So we've come to say we're going to need cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. I want to take a step back and say, what we're talking about in general is that justice and equity should be part of any climate change mitigation policy. And EJ and equity should not be left to chance or addressed later. That happens a lot where policymakers will say, let's take care of climate change now and we'll address the justice aspects later. No, we've heard that, especially as people of color, for a long time now, and we're not acquiescing to that. We may not be able to stop it, but if you're going to do that, it's going to be over our objections. And the market should not make EJ and equity decisions for us. They should be planned and they should be intentional. And I'm about at my time limit now. I'm at 20 minutes. Let me take a few more minutes to mention something else, a few more concepts. I just want to say that even if this concept is incorporated into a market-based policy like carbon trading, that doesn't mean the EJ community will then say, well, we're all right with carbon trading, because there are other problems with carbon trading, and ask us about that during the question and answer session. And I want to finish by talking about Transportation and Climate Initiative. I talked about policies that address power plants. This proposed policy will address greenhouse gases from mobile sources. And again, in the EJ community, we're down with that. But what we're not down with is that, guess what is going to be the core policy of this initiative? A carbon trading system. And for all the reasons I've talked about, that is why we're opposing the carbon trading system being used, and we're opposing the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Normally, I conclude by challenging my audience to say to make obtaining emissions reductions for EJ communities as important as obtaining greenhouse gas reductions. Because a lot of people say we want to prioritize EJ, right, environmental justice. Well, if you do, then accept this challenge. And it is a harder challenge than it may sound like on the surface. But with this audience of young folks, I want to say, we'll challenge you to do that, but what we'll also do is deputize you. And we want you to go out and spread this word. We want to deputize you as ambassadors for the EJ community, because not many people hear this critique of carbon trading. So we want you to go out, and if you hear how good carbon trading is, or how good the Transportation and Climate Initiative is, we want you to say, wait a minute, do you know about the EJ problem that exists with carbon trading or with the Transportation and Climate Initiative? And then we want you to explain what the problems are from our perspective, because we're not in enough spaces and we can't reach everybody, and we need help reaching people. And if you do that for us, you'll make the little girl you see in this picture, who's a member of an EJ community, you'll make her a little bit happier than she appears to be now. I'm going to stop there. I apologize to Maria for going, oh, I'm not too bad, 2.5 minutes over, and I want to turn it over to Maria.
Thanks.
And I'm going to stop share, Elise.
That was really great, as always. And it's nice to have I think there's often energy that's generated to want to do something after this. So it's nice to be given some feedback on that as well, even if it's just sharing a message or knowledge. Okay, so we're going to shift now to Maria Lopez-Nunez. We have someone introducing her first, just a quick introduction. So if you want to take over, and then we'll let Maria talk to us.
Okay, so last but not least, our final speaker of our symposium is Maria Lopez-Nunez. A native to Bushwick, Maria is a dedicated, fierce, and highly effective community leader in environmental justice. She is the Deputy Director of Advocacy and Organizing at the Ironbound Community Corporation, a member of the Climate Justice Alliance, Right to City, Grassroots Global Justice, and along with Nicky Sheats, was recently appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Maria also played an integral role in the passing of the Cumulative Impacts Bill in New Jersey. Additionally, she facilitated the passing of the Right to Counsel in New York City and the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which was a national model for police accountability. Maria is tireless in her community advocacy work, continuously challenging the current systems of oppression. When asked how she sees fights for gender, racial, and economic equality, and the protection of the environment intertwine, Maria responded, "You can't separate them. That's at the heart of environmental justice. The only way we'll win is if it's a fight for social justice to reform our society. The racist, sexist systems depend on each other to exist. Separating our gender and our race and our economic status, it separates us from ourselves. It does that dissecting of life that's getting us to this problem to begin with." And now Maria will talk to us about the Cumulative Impacts Bill and her work as a community organizer.
Same problem, I think. Have I made you a co-host yet, Maria? I think I have not done that. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Okay. Now you should be able to speak and share. My apologies.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and Nicky's gonna hook me up with sharing the screen at the later point. But okay, hi everyone. I'm really thankful to be here, especially along my really my friend, right? Like when we're beyond colleagues, Nicky Sheats, Dr. Nicky Sheats. I'm Maria Lopez, and I'll start off by just describing the Ironbound. Like let's take a break from all the weeds we've been in. I love my trusted academic colleagues, but I think it's always important to get back to the community level when we're talking about environmental justice. So in the Ironbound neighborhood, right? So I represent just a neighborhood in Newark. It's not the whole city, but in our neighborhood, which is about 4 square miles, give or take, we have the country's longest Superfund site. And so that's the Passaic River. It's 17 miles worth of a Superfund site, which is where in this country we produced, it was the largest production center of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. And what the country was doing is dioxin, a byproduct of Agent Orange, which is a really cancer-causing dust, a white dust. They were just putting the barrels into the river, and then that dust that was on the factory floors, as the trucks were coming in to pick up Agent Orange, they were getting it all over their wheels and spreading it all across the neighborhood. So this is, I think, a good, for me, always a reminder that before people were writing papers about environmental justice, there was environmental racism happening in our communities and across the country, before we had the terminology. Because I really resist this idea that EJ started anywhere, right? There have always been people on this land who lived in right relationship with the earth, and we're not in this really extractive relationship with the earth, So I think it's always important to remember that, because this is indigenous land. But yeah, Agent Orange was being produced in the Ironbound, and dioxin was getting everywhere. What's ironic is in the Ironbound, as they figured out Agent Orange, the byproduct has gotten everywhere, it's contaminated the neighborhood. It was at the time when the neighborhood was being proposed to have 3 or 4 incinerators, right? Because New Jersey thought, oh, here's a great idea. Let's put an incinerator in every county. And of course, richer counties were saying, we don't need to, we can pay our way out of this. And so they were coming to Newark, who had already become their dumping ground, and saying, we're going to put it in Newark. What's ironic about that is, despite the Ironbound Communities Corporation leadership there in terms of fighting that law at the state level, that law was defeated, and many counties in New Jersey were spared, but there were 2 incinerators that were built regardless of that. And one was in Camden, a majority Black city, and the other one was in Newark, another majority Black city. So that's where, Nikki's chart does not, I can hear it 1,000 times, Nikki, because it's always true, right? And as long as it remains to be true, we need to keep saying it. So we got the state's largest garbage incinerator, Covanta. Right now it's called Covanta. And we burn almost 1 million tons of trash there a year. And most of that trash is not being generated in Newark. There's a really small percentage of that trash is being generated in Newark. We have 30 reporting municipalities, and 40 to 50%, give or take, a month of that trash is actually coming from New York City. People don't think of New York City and think of Newark, but we're intrinsically related. Another thing that's happening in our neighborhood is that we have 2 power plants. We're the proposed 3rd power plant right now. And we're also next to the port of Newark, right? Which is where You know, you think about New York City, you think about this metropolitan area, and most of that stuff has to come from overseas, and it's going to come to the port, which is the largest port on the Eastern Seaboard. And out of that, you know, after the big boats deliver it, it gets on a truck. And then those trucks only have a couple of ways out, which the Ironbound is cross-sected by, right? So we have 1 and 9 on one end, the turnpike, 21 and 78, you know, so like if you're coming in and out of New Jersey and going to New York and trying to make your way west, you're probably cutting by the Ironbound. And what I say is most people fly over us or drive by us, but they don't really care about us, right? So that was evidenced last year by Covanta started burning a fuchsia purple, right? And the only reason anyone cared is because the commuters on their way home, I guess now it's 2 years, on the way home from New York City, they were worried about their health. You know, no one cared about the community that's right next to Covanta because we can walk there with, you know, all the kids from the elementary schools. So this is just to give you an example. What do we mean when we're saying cumulative impacts, right? Because I always say that to a third grader, it's very obvious what the cumulative impacts is. They stand on the corner, they look this way. There's the smokestacks from Newark Energy Center. You could see Covanta in the distance. You know, you can't swim in the river. There's over 100 brownfield sites in our neighborhood. There's the fat rendering place, the plastics place, you know, like you name it, we got it. I'm only giving you a preview of what is in this small concentrated area. And now who lives there? It's mostly Black and brown low income people, right? On some maps, we don't even appear to be people of color, but that's because we estimate that almost 80% of our population, our community is undocumented. So they're not even being captured by census tracts. You know, that's one of our issues with the EPA screen is they didn't talk to communities about it. So obviously out of that legacy, Ironbound has been around for 50 years. And we realized really early on that there was chemical explosions, asthma, a disproportionate amount of asthma in our neighborhood, and that trying to make our community's life better wasn't just about access to school and education and social services, that we needed to get to the root cause of issues, right? We needed to figure out what are the ways that the rules must be rewritten. And as someone that, you know, my whole legacy, my whole time at ICC has been, it feels like, what do we call it, whack-a-mole? There's a permit application coming in and we have to go to our experts. I know a lot of people would love to hook us up with lawyers, but we have really good colleagues like Nicky, Sheats, and Avna Baptista that really help guide us as community. We have trusted advisors that help increase our capacity. You know, we joined the fight that Nicky and the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance had started almost 12 years ago, right? That's how long it took to get the cumulative impacts law passed. And, you know, one thing I will say is that we were not getting help from mainstream organizations. Like Nicky said, to mainstream organizations that seemed implausible, first of all, like we're not even going to get this law, and two, irrelevant. Like this is not dealing with climate change. And part of the issue is we need to stop the problem before we're trying to fix things, you know, because every day new permits are being reviewed and approved across the country in communities that are going to be disproportionately impacted, and we must stop those permits. We don't have mechanisms to do that. And that's one thing that is the strongest part of the law. First, the law defines what is an EJ community. And an environmental justice community in New Jersey, according to the law, and Nicky, maybe you'll have to jump in if I get it wrong, it's 40% people of color or linguistic isolation, right? Or 35%, I got it off the top of my head, or 35% people who are low income, you know? And what's really important and operative about the law is the ors, right? So if any community in New Jersey, and this is at the census block level, meets that criteria, then that means that the law is triggered. When the law is triggered, then we check to see if the facility that wants a permit, is it going to cause a higher cumulative impacts? And, you know, one way I like to explain it is this law allows the DEP, the people who issue the permits, the Department of Environmental Protection, to actually see us as a community, to not look at every facility as an individual, which is a very American thing, right? You're an individual facility, you can go right up to the limit of the top of what you're allowed to permit, pollute. Another individual, they can go right up to the limit to the top, and everyone can reach their limits, and that's okay. The law never puts them together up until now. Now the law is going to see what does it mean together? What is the toxic soup that your facility is moving into? And that is acknowledging historic wrongdoing based on race and class. And then if you're adding to that higher, we're not saying disproportionate, we're just saying if it's if you're hiring the impact, then if it's a new facility, it also mandates, it's not suggestive, it mandates that the facility's permit shall be denied. You know, it's my favorite words, shall be denied. It's not maybe, it's telling you what to do. You have to deny that facility, except, of course, in the case of a compelling public interest in the host community, which is really important. You know, it says it has to be down to the sensitive block level, like what is the benefit you have to provide? And obviously we're in fierce argument about what constitutes a compelling public interest. And obviously as an environmental justice community, we're fighting for that to be the most narrow interpretation of the law. If you are a facility seeking renewal, as there are so many in our neighborhoods doing that right now, I'm still waiting on Covanta's permit renewal. It's been 3 years since that's been in province. So it's only a 5-year permit, to give you some context. Then the DEP shall impose, may impose conditions. And that's going to be important because those conditions will hopefully mitigate public health and reduce, you know, the impact that it's having on our community, you know, and that goes the same for renewals and expansion. So those are the really key parts of the law. Other parts of the law that I like are the mandates around community engagement for facilities, but also for the DEP. Right now, the DEP has discretion as to whether to provide a public hearing. Obviously, if you're in a neighborhood like, and you have an ICC, we're watchdogs, so we keep an eye on it. We always request public hearings, but there are plenty of neighborhoods that do not. So hopefully we're gonna increase public notification. The DEP is allowed to charge fees to provide technical assistance to the applicant and the community. So hopefully that will help with some of the equity issues, you know? So I think I don't like to hear myself talk quite as much as my colleagues. I like to keep it short. Those are the main parts of the law. And one thing I will say is they were achieved by the environmental justice community, because one thing that's important is that we're often condescended to, acting like, oh, well, if only that community had a little bit more help. Yeah, of course. Could we use help? Always, and more money. But I would never underestimate the ability of the community to speak for itself and to fight and to get things done, right? To get laws passed, laws that make a difference, and to not compromise, because I fundamentally believe that if it had been someone else that didn't represent our communities directly at the negotiating table, this law would not be historic. It would have been watered down and someone might have got a good headline out of it, but it wouldn't be as strong as it is and have all the possibility that the EJ law has. That's why it's important to make sure that those that are most directly impacted and that are accountable to our community, that they're the ones leading on any given issue. And that even for academics, you know, and well-intentioned allies, that you fall to the back and you follow the community's lead to be in service of it, not to think you got the big brains in the room and you should be leading us, you know, because our communities know and have expertise of lived experience, you know, day to day, living with the smells, being awoken by them, living with the trucks, living with the asthma, living with the direct issues really makes you learn the depth and to be creative in your solution seeking. So I'll just leave it there. I appreciate y'all having us on.
Thank you so much for that. Lots of really, really powerful points and messages. So let's open it up to questions. I saw someone. So Joseph DeAndrea had a question. Do you want to ask your question? Fine. Could you raise your hand again so I can, oh, there you are.
Am I on?
Yeah.
All right, so this goes for any of the speakers, really. It's a very broad question. And it's one I couldn't help but think of in all the conversation about particulates and the environmental pollution. What is your opinion on the relation between the nuclear power industry and race? Do I need to repeat that?
I was waiting for Maria. She gave me a nod. So I'm glad you asked that. In particular, there was a question before about technology also. So look, the EJ community has taken a stance against several what we call false solutions. Nuclear is one of them. We're not in favor of nuclear energy for several reasons. I wish our colleague Cecilia Martinez was here because she always talks about nuclear and how the waste was brought to Native American communities, right? And they're still feeling the impact of that, and they're still trying to do that. But the other thing I'll say about it is that to me, more broadly, when we, because with the nuclear waste, I'm sure everybody knows, you can't do anything with it, right? I mean, you got to
pretty much junk, yeah.
And it's just, and to me, it represents the wrong way of doing things. I mean, when we started putting pollution in the atmosphere through the Industrial Revolution, we really at that time didn't know any better, but now we do. I mean, we know that this, that this waste, we can't do anything with it, and so we got to find another way to do things. The other piece of technology that we've and policy that we've come out against are carbon capture, sequestration. Maria's told you about the incinerators that keep plaguing our communities, and biomass burning also, are all things that are being considered now by governments that the EJ community is against.
Yeah, no, you can keep it more simple than that. I'm like, why would you mess with something that can blow you up? I don't know, I'm just like really old fashioned here, but I think human arrogance knows no limits. And this idea that you can control it. Oh, well, we got better technology now. Don't worry, we got this. And it's like, we've heard this before, and I'm not, I think we all need to take hold the line there of not letting some of our science friends, that's why I'm like, yes, I trust science to a point. I think it could become a little fanatical as well. And we just got to be in right relationship with the earth and with each other, and not let our arrogance, oversee what, no one's getting hurt from wind and solar. Let's stick to things that work.
I had a follow-up question too. It has almost nothing to do with it. It's mainly for fun. I kind of just want to hear your opinion. Did either of the two speakers see the new Godzilla movie that came out? On the topic of nuclear energy. Am I muted?
I didn't get the last part. Say that again.
On the topic of nuclear energy, mainly as a fun question, did either of you see the Godzilla versus Kong movie that came out?
Oh.
That's a shame. You should. It's fun.
He and I do panels on Sundays and Fridays. So we haven't
I don't
had
have
time
time
for
for a
fun.
movie.
No, well, my favorite TV show was Supernatural. Anybody watch that?
That's a good one.
Yeah. I'm into science fiction.
Jordan, you had a question?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for being here, all of you, and really providing your expertise. I just have a question about how much reach do you think that you're going to have now that some of us, Nicky and Maria, you have do you think that you have that ear of the White House? How much do you think having an advisory group, do you think that you have some influence to be able to carry this to the national level, or just some reflections on that?
It's Nicky. I mean, for me, I'll start because I guess I'm a little cynical. I'm excited, of course, and I'm happy that folks are talking environmental justice. Hello. I'm excited that folks are finally talking, like not finally. Folks have been talking, but now it's on a different level. But I will say, I still want to see more resources going to help defend environmental justice and to define what it means, to make sure that it's not just advisory councils, that we are having impacts in interagency ways, and that we're saying no to false solutions, because I don't think we can say we're prioritizing environmental justice while we're considering carbon trading, carbon tax, nuclear, subsidize, we're not ending subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. So I'm waiting and seeing, I'm gonna see, I'm excited about all the colleagues that are on these, both inside EPA, other parts of the White House. We've had a lot more immersion, right, of EJ, but I'm still gonna wait and see conservatively over here.
Michael, you have a question? Or I don't know, Nikki, do you want to add to that first, maybe?
No, I agree with that. I think we're gonna the proof is in the proof is in the pudding. We're gonna, but we think we have more opportunities now. As Maria said, we have more people on the inside in this new White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and seemingly more attention to EJ. I want to point out two things, though, that historically, I think it's been true that the people I argue with most about EJ has been the progressive community, not the conservative community. I guess I'm not in position to to engage them a lot, but the people that I typically argue with the most has been the progressive community. And even before Biden, EJ, one thing I think the EJ community had done was been successful at was moving the concept of EJ from the margins of discussion to the mainstream of discussion. But that also made EJ a sexy issue for a whole lot of people and a whole lot of organizations to have more name value, more clout, or wider, have more resources than we do. So it also presented a challenge that we could be marginalized in our own space. And who's going to decide who defines EJ when groups with bigger name values, with more name recognition come into the space and start making decisions. So we have an opportunity, certainly with the Biden administration in, and more people paying attention to EJ, but we still have a lot of challenges and some threats too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd like to hear more about those details, just what those threats are from the progressive community.
And I should add academic institutions. Let me be somewhat self, what do you call it? Examine my own motives. I'm with the academic institution. So as academic institutions move into this space also, that presents possibilities, opportunity, but also a threat.
Glad you're both bringing that up. Okay, Michael had a question.
So my question was, with the recent growth, like over the past decade of movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, has that influenced any policy changes, or have you noticed any changes in environmental justice specifically because of those movements?
And any of, just to say that any of the speakers are welcome to answer these questions too, if you have more to add. But yeah, I don't know if Maria or Nikki or Charles or Rob, if any of you want to take that one.
Yeah, let's. I'm sure we'll add to this that the Black Lives Matter movement directly affected the EJ law that was passed in Jersey. I mean, I think we were at the stage where we were going to have an EJ law because we had been, fighting for it. It had been introduced, and we've been fighting for it since mid-2018. So I think there was a good, I shouldn't be so definitive. There was a good possibility we were going to have an EJ law, but we were still getting a lot of pushback on how strong it was going to be. As Maria indicated, we were ready to walk away if it wasn't going to be strong enough. We were really, we were ready to do that. But I think the Black Lives Matter movement, we noticed a change in tone, and in what was willing to be accepted by our state government in Black Lives Matter movement. I'll let Maria say more about that. She's the organizer. And she was involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, which I was not, actually, except of course that I'm Black and get harassed by the police.
Yeah, no, I think I think it highlights an important thing. There's always these catalyst moments, and last summer certainly was one, and helped this law be the strongest. But it also speaks of you have to be doing the work, because then when these moments happen, if you don't have the work to push forward, then you can't start from scratch. Because as we saw, unfortunately, this country's on a racial awareness merry-go-round, right? Like they're aware for a second, it matters, and then people fade back away. So when we had that moment, luckily it was synergy. We were working on the EJ law. We were able to push it forward and get that shall deny, that I'm not sure would have been possible without Black Lives Matter.
So I think, Harold, your hand was up next.
Maybe that's a follow-up question to Joseph, so answers what Maria indicated and Nicky said very clearly. We, of course, an institution, an academic institution, and invite you all, and we really appreciate that you're coming, but I think we would also like to know what we could do as individuals, maybe also as academic institutions, because we don't know, you are, Maria, you are aware of all of this. So maybe you can name a few things, what students, what faculty, but I don't know, everyone can do besides raising awareness. And I think that would be really helpful for all of us.
Yeah, for sure. I love answering this, and I'm not a softie. I would say you have to build a relationship. Like often academic institutions, I'll be honest, are full of themselves. Like you write a paper, you think you did the work, and it's like, no, there's people who are fighting for this life and death, right? And so always putting that first and like humanizing it, that someone this is their day-to-day, you have to listen to them, and you should build a relationship, because there's also, I'll be honest, I'm distrustful sometimes with academic institutions. It takes me a second to warm up, as you can imagine, because I'm protective of our community. And oftentimes the institution has been extractive. They want to get a story, they want to get some data points, plop them on a map, they write a paper, they go present on our community, and they never talk to us again, or only when it's convenient, they name drop us. But when you build a solid relationship, it's because you've been doing the work for years, like with Bob Laumbach. We've been working with him and his center for years, with Nicky. Like Nicky has our back. I know I can call him, I can call Ana Bautista at the New School. They're committed academics to the cause, and then they become completely part of it in a way that's undeniable and inextricable. So I say, like, that's my biggest point, is build a deep relationship. And that might mean that you have to earn folks' trust, because you keep coming back. It's not just a semester long project, it's not just one paper.
Thank you.
And I made a conscious decision when I got my job. I was at Thomas Edison State University, now I'm at Kean, to be within the EJ community. Right, I'm sure that in academia, most academics will not identify themselves as part of the EJ community, because they want to have that neutrality. And I made a conscious decision, because I knew there were bad relationships between EJ communities and academic institutions. A lot of that had to do with academic institutions coming and scooping up money on EJ issues. And I made sure that, I'm starting to get money now, because I've been in the EJ movement for so long, but for like the first 15 years, and still, I won't take money unless it's in conjunction with some EJ group or initiative or something. I won't go out and get money on my own. And I made a conscious decision to be within the EJ community. And I didn't know if that would hurt me in academic circles, but and for transparency, I say, I didn't say today, I should have said, usually I say, look, I just want everybody to know that I'm talking about this from within the EJ movement. So I'm not unbiased. I'm not neutral. I try to help the EJ community develop the best possible public policy from an EJ perspective. But I don't want to belabor the point, but I think this has been an issue in academia for a long time. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the first African American studies departments were formed. And there was great debate about whether they should be formed. And when I graduated from grad school, I remember that there was a meeting in New York, and now I'm gonna, man, and I'm forgetting the center, which I will be pilloried by the Black community, but they held a conference that were Black academics, and the older Black academics were chiding the younger Black academics because they said, you know, we didn't form African American studies departments for you to come in and be traditional academics. You know, when we formed this, we were part of the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement. And that was the concept. And I don't know what the result, I couldn't go, so I don't know what the result of that was, but they were having that discussion, you know, between the old guard and the new guard and saying, you know, you were part of the Black movement. So, you know, discussion goes on, right, from within academia.
Good. Thank you.
I see Charles. Charles, we don't want to exclude you. It looked like you were you were anxious to say something. You know, you've been in this so long. You have thoughts on that?
Well, no, I mean, I think all this that you guys have said is really important. You know, I think there's a new thread of discussion around this that has to do with this idea. People like Omega Wilson and others really advance it very, very strongly. Community, Margaret Gordon, you know, out in West Oakland, advances it. This idea of community-owned knowledge. You know, that is not just a question of, you know, who gets control of the information that's gathered, right? But who gets credit for it? You know, that's really important. And I think the you know, some of the possibilities of things that take place, that are happening in terms of technology can be used in such a way, and organizing can be done in such a way that, you know, that builds up that. You know, it's kind of like what, you know, Maria and Nicky said, you know, if you want to parse it out, then you get to this question of like, you know, the academic goes to the community. Well, they might have done some arguments on good work, but, you know, then at the end of the day, who gets to present on the information? You know, in places like Harvard, right? You know, or places like, you know, Fairleigh Dickinson or other places, right? You know, it's the academic, and it's not done. But, you know, who really is the source of that information? And who really should be having some control and credit for it. So I think that's another part of this discussion that, I mean, people in academia should really think about that in terms of their role and their relationship, like Maria talked about, developing a relationship, but then it's actually more, it goes deeper than that, you know, and so that's one way to look at it. You know, the other way to look at it too is, I mean, I think part of the issue that has to do with that question around, that Nicky raised around the difference between environmentalism and environmental justice, right? It has to do with how do communities own see the world, right? And what kind of knowledge comes out of communities, and what kind of information or knowledge comes out of more the more trained academic governmental kind of institutions. And one is they're very different ways of looking at the world, and so I think that's another area that you know, one does well to address that, to kind of understand what that is, because, you know, I mean, I think we're going around a lot of things, but you need to connect the dots. You know, Nicky talked about the you know, this issue that where if you're talking about the issues around emissions trading and you know, the politics or the policies related to the co-pollutants, and whether you take into equity, kind of equity and things like that when we're developing climate policy. Well, there's this whole thing about, I mean, when my report was, we sent my report to EPA, I got the answer back that says EPA deals with issues of technology and not sociology. I mean, that was an answer to the report, right? But if you go back further, there's a whole thing about the U.S., Bill Ruckel's house during the first administration that EPA was established. He went and talked to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, when they were asked about dealing with issues of equity, and I'm not sure exactly the right words and how it all came out, but it essentially basically said, we got to deal with the environmental protection mission first before we deal with the equity mission or the civil rights mission, right? So they kind of separated out then, and you can see that being separated out ever since, So this is a pretty big discussion over there, and I mean, this is why I think more conversations like this would be helpful.
I think Jeff, you were next.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to ask, and this could go for any of the speakers, about the element of geography. And obviously it's going to be different it's going to vary on the individual level. But if I wanted to ask if you find a trend of, do the members of these communities have an interest, or do they want to live elsewhere where the risks are lower, but they can't access it? Or do they want to stay in their homes and just have the conditions be better geographically?
Would someone like to take that one?
I wanted Maria to take the first hack at that one. She's the closest to the community. I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, Maria.
Yes, I mean, I think the question is a little weird, to be honest with you, Jeff. But it's not unusual. We get asked that a lot, of like, do folks want to move somewhere better? I just argue racism created these conditions, and it shouldn't be whether people should they be allowed to move? Should we like subsidize them from leaving? I think what we do to those we least respect in this society, which in America is Black and brown people, indigenous people, low-income people, those are the people we least respect. What we've decided is okay for our communities is just it's an example of how we treat the earth, right? Like we think we could just grow endlessly, burn endlessly, pollute endlessly, and someone else gonna pick up the tab. Or those that are the richest among us, they're gonna go to Mars. Like that's kind of like where my mind goes. And I'm sorry, but the question, it's not you, but it does anger me, because it's almost like, why don't these people just leave? And it's like, no, I know, but you might not intend that, but that's what I hear, because we get asked that a lot. Like, why don't you just leave? Or why don't, I've been asked, why don't I focus my advocacy efforts in trying to get people to move and understand the risk, as if they're responsible for the mess in our community. We should have a choice. Nowhere should be a place that our people can't leave. And I don't know, because I think I could answer that question, but I just don't want to send the wrong message by answering it. I think we need to deal with historic messes that we've created. I hope you're not getting defensive, because it's like I said, it's not personal. It's just a question we get asked incredibly often. And I think it doesn't deal with the heart of the issue, which is we've left whole swaths of America and the world, right? We've created just sacrifice zones, dead zones in the ocean. And so we need to stop and upend that inherent bad equation. I'll leave it there. I know it kind of just gets me emotional, and I know it's not you, but I would question the line of thinking behind that question.
Yeah. No, I totally
Oh, well.
understand. And that's not, I didn't mean to, I wasn't trying to ask like, why don't people leave? I was asking if like, I was curious as to whether making moving more feasible is a part of this or not. If that, if that like, is it that they can't, that has to do with income or, it just not being welcome in other communities or whatever it may be. Not saying they should leave, but just wondering if that.
And I'll stop you there. It's just because even that is like, yeah, we have to end white supremacy. Like we need to end like so that people can be free to migrate, so that communities, there is no one living in poverty and they have the right to live in any community, of course.
Right.
But I think when we're talking about environmental justice, if we start opening those doors as solutions, then we're not dealing with the root cause of the issue. We think we can just maybe displace people. I see right now with sea level rise, people are like, well, we might have to do planned retreat, and in New Jersey, the report just came out, most of the public housing is in sea level rise. And because of the inequalities in our society, I just know that's not going to end well for us. We're going to end up displaced and scattered to the winds, and there is no accountability in our society. So I love science fiction, but I don't engage in science fiction now. Like I try to force the issue and force us to fix the damn problem that, we've created historically, but I think we can leave it there.
Sure.
And then I think
Richard was next. Yeah, Richard was next.
Hey, thanks everybody. This is a wonderful way to spend my Sunday afternoon. Learned a lot. I am a geographer, so this is another geography question. I was really happy to see across the four discussants today, multiple scales represented. You had the federal policy, New Jersey state level policy, and then we got down to the community and local level. And I was on that question actually with two things, and I'm really glad that Maria, you just brought up sacrifice zones, and you brought up Agent Orange and the Passaic River, but a number of different times today, we have Agent Orange, lithium in the batteries that we're talking about. The Port of Elizabeth is a local experience for many people who are exposed to premature death in numerous ways, but all of these are also connected to a global infrastructure, which we haven't heard a lot about, and that the community intimacies in Passaic, right, especially think Agent Orange, have for a very long time been part of an international supply chain of premature death elsewhere, lithium as well, for instance, in the Bolivian lithium mines and things like this. So I was just wondering if, and I do know also with Agent Orange, during the civil rights movement, there was a lot of activism over the development and deployment of Agent Orange in Korea, with connecting it, like Paul Robeson connected it to the civil rights movement locally. So I was wondering if there's any benefit to thinking about these sacrifice zones, not just as they're experienced locally. Is there any kind of community advocacy or connections with the international impacts of these exposures to premature death? That is, that the Agent Orange in the Passaic River, the lithium mines in our electric cars, the Port of Elizabeth, and a global supply chain of carbon sucking, monsters. Is there a way that activism can change on the ground, or are there conversations as there were in the 40s and 50s on those questions?
I want to hog all the questions from my colleagues, but since it's Newark based, yes, of course, and we have, sister cities that we try to do engagement with, particularly around the issues with the Passaic River. I think the Passaic River, luckily in ICC, I feel always really fortunate and privileged to work for an organization that has such a long legacy. At the beginning, we were exchanging with Lois Gibbons, right, from the Love Canals, and having synergy there and just expanding translocally within the US. And then, of course, trying to broaden even further to say, while Agent Orange hurt us here, it hurt other people much, much worse, right? Because when you try to poison other people, you poison yourself, but you still poison someone else, and you have to take accountability for that, which is why, to go back, there is that analysis of what's at the heart of this, it is imperialism, it is white supremacy, and like it's uncomfortable because we're supposed to be having an academic conversation. And I think Charles, you said it, right? People think that's sociology or history, but for our communities, it's real. And it's really wonderful to connect with other communities. And that's impacted the positions we take. For instance, with the cleanup, we have a community advisory group. And one of the votes that they took is not to, when we were dismantling the factory itself that built the Agent Orange, not to send that to a hazardous facility that might have been on indigenous land, but to say, okay, like we don't want to be cleaned up at the sacrifice of another community. And so that led to that land, honestly, it's going to be useless forever because they had to dig a giant hole in the wall and make what's essentially a grave site. They had to line it with concrete, put everything, so they dismantled the factory, buried it in there, and now it's just like dead land that we'll never have access to, because you can't do anything on top of it because you could break the cap, right? But it was better to keep it here than for us to vote to send it somewhere else. And same with, now the river is going to be dredged. And we had similar conversations in our community of, we don't want that to be processed elsewhere. We're probably going to have to deal with it ourselves, and so how do we be in solidarity, but recognizing that we're not the ones with the most resources? It's like when people tell our communities, if only we just had more recyclable bags. And I'm like, that's not going to solve the issue. We need to think at scale. And that's why also with carbon trading, we have to stand with indigenous communities in the Amazon that get used as carbon sequestration and displaced, so it's really important for us to maintain a global perspective always, so I'll just leave it there.
And and we should, I guess we should say, like I don't work on the international level, but that's because I've made a decision that I'm so overwhelmed on the national and say I can't. But both Ironbound Community Corporation, where Maria works, and New Jersey EJ Alliance, which I'm a part of, both of our organizations are part of the national grassroots EJ movement, and so we're connected that way, and that's part of the reason why we know, as Maria says, what's going on in other areas. And I think, the reason we came up with the climate change policy that we have now, that I talked to you about, and led us to oppose carbon trading, is because we were so concerned about the local air pollution. And in New Jersey, that's how we jumped on that policy, because the communities were coming to us about the local air pollution, about the incinerators in Camden and Newark, about the bus air pollution, about a cement factory, I say bus, diesel air pollution, right, and all over the state, about a cement factory in Camden. And it kept, that's what communities were coming to us about. And so, that's how we developed that policy, that if you're going to have climate change mitigation policy, we got to make it connected to help local air pollution, and not just take, kind of a more global point of view. And so when we talk about policy, like Maria was saying, in New Jersey, we say this: we're not going to implement any policy that may hurt the EJ groups out in Chicago. And they've told us that, right, Maria? You all have to hold the line on the Transportation and Climate Initiative in the Northeast, because if it's implemented in the Northeast, it's coming to the Midwest next. And we try, and they try for us too.
I don't know if, there's so much in that question, and I just want to build on what Maria and Nicky said, but there's a book recently by Michael Mendez, and it's called Climate Change from the Streets. And it's about the, EJ movement and the climate policy in California. And there's a whole chapter in there about the interrelationship between grassroots groups in California and those in other parts of the world, and how they work together. And so that's just one other perspective. But I just wanted to kind of build on one thing that Maria said, which is that I remember when I went down to Warren County in 1982, I had this conversation with people there and they were asking about, remember now the PCB that, we're going to end up in Warren County was not, nobody there had anything to do with its creation, right? And so they were saying, well, they heard about this waste site in Alabama, in this place called Emile, Alabama, which essentially was the chemical waste, the waste management's chemical waste, hazardous waste disposal site over there. And so, they said, well, why can't we move it there? And, now, of course, Emile is in the Alabama Black Belt. And so there was a conversation I had with people in Warren County about how, that was just a community just like theirs, and so fast forward 12 years when the landfill leached, and they had a process by which they were trying to figure out what to do with the waste there. And there was a citizens advisory committee, and that the community took the position that rather than moving it off-site, which was the engineer's suggestion, which was cheaper, and bury it somewhere else, they said they wanted to detoxify it on site. Why? Because they said that it's going to end up in another community just like theirs. That is a remarkable story. That's a really great story, right? And I wrote about it in a chapter, an article I did for the Golden Gate Law Journal's inaugural issue, Environmental Law Journal's inaugural issue that Luke Cole edited. So I just want to share that story with you. I mean, this is a big issue, and it's a big issue that just is so many interlocking parts. But there's a real important kind of perspectives to be shared, not just because people talk about it, but because of the practice, because of what people did in relationship to it.
So we'll take one more question, Marion, and then I apologize that we're keeping you over time.
Right. This was Dr. Sheats. He had mentioned that, and first off, thank you all for this discussion. And about the carbon trading, and you had said how basically, if I understand it correctly, that it can work against the EJ communities, because if you have an area where it's not much, I guess, air pollution, it will counterbalance where there is a problem in the EJ community. How is it counted? Is it counted by state? When you say the carbon trading, how like if there's a place where it's where it's not as polluted would counterbalance the EJ community, where's that place? The rest of the state? Or just to understand how it's measured,
Yeah, good question. Well, right now, New Jersey is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And the history of that is it was originally part of it, and then under Democratic governor, the Republican governor pulled us out. Democratic governor we have now put us back in. The EJ community, it opposed us going back in for the reasons I laid out and other reasons. And it has 10 Northeastern states in it, and they do it by state.
Okay.
So you have to. In New Jersey, I think it's about 23 power plants that are part of the initiative in New Jersey. Yeah. So as long as they reach the goal in New Jersey, then it's all right. Amongst those 23 power plants. And not only it can hurt EJ communities because emissions can increase under carbon trading, but I think the more important thing is that it's missing an opportunity to help EJ communities. I think, to me, that's more troublesome, and I think that's what normally happens, because it's not using a policy, that if you're going to have the policy anyway, we might as well use it to not only, let's get double bang for your buck, not only to fight climate change, but to help these EJ communities. And if we don't use it that way, we're going to miss an opportunity that may never come again to save lives in EJ communities. Now, I always remind people that if your child dies because of local air pollution, when and if we win the fight against climate change, your child is not going to be resurrected. If they're killed by local air pollution, they're just as dead as if they're killed by climate change. Right. So we need to save those lives while we fight climate change. And one thing I wanted to say, okay, see, now you got me started. Another problem with carbon trading is that the purpose that economists brought this up, and I have a undergrad degree in economics, so I was trained like this, is to minimize cost. And is that really how we want our society organized? While we fight climate change, shouldn't we be minimizing the lives lost as opposed to the cost to industry? I mean, as a society, that just shouldn't be where we're at.
If I could add, because Nicky, look, it took me a couple of years of listening to Nicky to even get what he was saying. And I see you, Marion, you're definitely right with him, but I have a feeling, other people might not be. But one thing about carbon trading that I always think about is like in the Ironbound, we have the latest natural gas plant, right, in New Jersey. They've been trying to build a couple more, but ours was just built, so it's like the newest technology. And so when they're making, we're gonna trade, we have the ability to pollute more because they run more efficiently. So an older power plant that is over polluting, like they could be like, we'll get that for you. They have a lot of space there to sell on their pollution because they're running at higher efficiencies. So because of where the power plants have been placed, when they do the little creative accounting, that's what or cartoon accounting, right? They just trade it away and it magically disappears. With the Transportation Climate Initiative, that's even more, I think, obvious, because I'm always like, okay, we got electric cars lowering on the emissions in the transportation sector, great. And I'm always like, electricity doesn't fall from the sky, it gets made in my damn community, because the electric grid is racist. And so we can't just switch over and not have a plan here and think the personal vehicle is going to drive our way into the future. All we're going to do is displace those emissions. And I'm afraid because once you displace them from the electric car, which is hurting everyone, you're going to focus it on the power plants, especially given the new fuel technology. And I'm not saying let's stick with fossil fuels. I'm just saying let's have a better plan because we get a couple good shots at this. And every time you pass a policy, you spend political capital. So every time something like this gets passed, it means that things that we want might not get passed. So that's, I think, how I consider the equation in a more layperson terms, even though I finally do get it after listening to Nicky for so long.
Right. Well, you said you just got a new what? A new
natural gas plant. Natural gas plant. Ours was built 2015.
Where are they fitting all of this? I mean, where's it? What's it was
on top of our backs. Like they just.
Did it knock down an existing building, or is it?
No. It's just we have so many brownfield sites that you can build housing on, but you can adapt the technology. Wow. Anyway, not the best example that I want to be, but
there's no problem putting it on a brownfield site, or they'll do that. I mean,
they'll clean it up first, and then they'll put some industry things. So we're fighting a sludge plant that has a similar issue. It has a cap, but everything's possible when you have money.
Yeah.
Anyway. So
thank you.
I like to always break it down for some of us in the audience that don't have all the prestigious degrees.
Thank you.
Okay. So maybe we can hold on, let me try to unmute everyone. I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, there we go. So maybe we can give everyone a round of applause. Thank you so much for giving your time. This is nice to hear sometimes instead of just seeing things on the little screens. But we just really appreciate you giving your time and sharing your experience and wisdom with all of us. So, and thanks to all of you who could come and learn as well. So
thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
if there are any more questions, please forward them to us, and I'm sure Elise can forward them to the speakers. And again, for the speakers, if you have any things which could be, you know, where we could provide some resources, please let us know too, so we can do some meaningful work as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Everybody have a good weekend.
All right. Yes.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Rest of the weekend.
Have a nice weekend.